This is Tempest Storm. This build feels extremely smooth and it has amazing attack speed and survivability. I'm only level 75 and I'm already feeling the power. And I have yet to unlock a huge amount of the power in the build. This build is extremely easy to play because you only have to use 3 skills. Tempest for damage, Warcry for utility, and Fury Leap for movement. Basically all of our damage in the build is going to come from one ability. Now I've tweaked the build to a point that I really like it, but I will let you know this is my first build for Last Epoch, and I plan to continue to refine the build all the way through the end game. But don't worry because the build feels very solid. And I also made you guys a custom loot filter to make your gameplay easy. If you like my content and want to support me, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe to this video. You can also stop by my Twitch stream at twitch.tv/streamhard. I also want to give a big shout out to McFluffin for letting me pick his brain about this build. Now let's get into the specifics of the build. Now before I show you the build planner, I wanted to show you the hot mess I've got going on in my inventory right now. I don't have a one-handed sword, which is my recommendation, which means I don't have any spell damage on this weapon. I am getting +2 to Primalist skills, which is nice, so this isn't a bad choice. I also have this relic, which happened to get a +1 to Warcry, and it gives me +1 to all of my Primalist skills. So I'm getting a bunch of extra random points that are pretty nice, but I don't think this is worth it in the end. Typically, you can trim the fat from the skill trees and get rid of stuff that's not as necessary, and you're gonna do a lot better with items that have pluses to other things. But if you do happen to get something like this, don't be afraid to use it until you get something better. Another honorable mention is the Vion's Chariot. This unique item is quite good on its own, and it's pretty comparable to the boots I recommend if it had a legendary potential. I just recently moved away from using critical strikes, so I still have some leftovers from that. So I'm not very well optimized right now, but you saw the gameplay of how it is right now. Once I get to level 100 in the end game, I'll make sure my itemization is more on point so I can show you a more accurate example of what the gameplay looks like. Just keep in mind what you've seen already is a little bit gimped compared to where it's going to be. Now, first things first, let's start with the active skills. On our hotbar, we're running Tempest as our main damage source. Now we have Swipe in case you run out of mana, but keep in mind that our Tempest Strike is going to have 0 mana cost eventually, so you shouldn't need this. Warcry is going to be a very important part of the build. Not only is this how we keep our totem out consistently, which is going to give us our elemental resistances as well as some other buffs like attack speed, but this is also going to give us stacks of Maelstrom, which means we're constantly dealing damage to things around us, and additionally is going to cause storm bolts as well as give us frenzy and haste. You're going to want to use your Warcry before every encounter. You can pretty much use it off cooldown and it'll keep your haste up constantly. Fury Leap we're putting in the build purely as an extra source of movement. This is great for getting over gaps and cutting corners. You can also use it for repositioning during a fight so you don't get hit by a big attack. We've got Maelstrom on the hotbar. This one we're not going to cast most of the time, but sometimes it's nice to spam Maelstrom just to give a lot of stacks right before you go into a fight. But again, it's not really necessary, so don't feel like you have to take this here. Now, if we go into our skills, we can look at our specializations. So we're specializing in Tempest Strike, Warcry, Maelstrom, Tornado, and Earthquake. The Tornado is going to be cast because we're using our Tempest Strike, and the Aftershocks from Earthquake are going to be cast because of our idols. Again, Maelstrom is cast because of Warcry, so the only 2 abilities here we're actually actively using is the Tempest Strike and the Warcry. Now let's go into the specifics. For Tempest Strike, especially early on, the first thing you're going to want to do is head over to Warm Shelter and Grounded Refuge. Resurgence of Land and Ancestral Swiftness are going to help you as well. All of these are going to contribute to your mana. And by contribute to your mana, I mean they're going to reduce the amount of mana you use when you use Tempest Strike. So definitely prioritize these and make sure you get yourself enough mana. Now, as soon as you feel like your mana is balanced out enough, the first thing you're going to want to do is head over and get Grand Cyclone. Not only are all the points on the way to Grand Cyclone pretty nice, but Grand Cyclone is going to give you a lot more of your procs for your Wind Tempest. Now finally, the last thing you're going to grab is your Ceaseless Typhoon. This is what's going to give us the chance to cast our tornadoes on hit. And because we've already gotten our Grand Cyclone, we're now going to be casting them more often. I'm going to go to Tornado next because we were just talking about Tornado. So in Tornado, the first things we're going to want to focus on is going over here and getting Aspect of the Storm and our Gusts of Renewal. We want to make sure our Tornado's not draining all of our mana. We can also get a lot more attack speed from Storm Dervish. Now, a quick point you can put in for some additional damage is Charged Storm. We're only putting the 1 point in here because we don't want to overdo the amount of mana we're going to be using by casting the Storm Bolts. Next up, we're going to do Lasting Storm, and I'd recommend pushing this to the max before going to Hurricane. And the very last thing you're going to get on the tree is going to be your Debris, because this is going to increase your mana cost, so you want to make sure you've got the build optimized before you add this in. Next up, I want to talk about Warcry. So I think for Warcry early on, the most beneficial thing you can probably get is Berserker and Fury Strikes. Now keep in mind early on, if you don't have the Totemic Heart, then you're going to have to replace the Maelstrom on your hotbar with any type of totem. And Thorn Totem is actually pretty useful early on for damage, so I'd recommend going with that one. Now the next thing we want is we want to get over here and get Whirlpool maxed out as quickly as possible. This is going to help us sustain our Maelstrom stacks, and Maelstrom is going to deal a lot of damage early on, and this also reduces the mana cost for it when it's cast this way, so it's quite nice. Now make sure you don't put extra points into things like Breath of Atera or Purging Shout, because we still want to get our totem as quickly as possible. Now for Maelstrom, your priority here is going to depend where you're at with your Warcry, but if you have your Warcry, obviously you want the Wind Fury and Windswept. Power of the Storm is going to give you additional damage, and we have to have at least 2 points in here for a maxed out Warcry in order to get our stacks right away. With 2 points here, if we cast our Warcry 1 time, it's going to automatically start casting the Storm Bolts. Also, you're going to want to change the damage over to physical as soon as you start scaling physical damage. I think that longer duration is one of the more useful things here. And then finally, once this is actually dealing some damage, Turmoil is going to increase the range by quite a bit, and you'll find yourself killing things without even attacking. Just a quick note here, if you go into extra mana efficiency either here or in your Tornado, it's perfectly fine. You can adjust these depending on your own personal needs. Finally, our last skill is going to be Earthquake. Now, like I said before, our Earthquake Aftershocks are only getting cast from melee attacks because of our idol. At max, this is going to be close to 20% chance per melee attack. The reason we went with Earthquakes is because Earthquake doesn't consume mana. That means no matter how many procs of it we get, we're going to be perfectly fine on our mana. Now, your first priority here is going to be getting your Storm Rift. The reason why I really like this here is because it's not converting any of our damage with Aftershocks to lightning damage, but it's adding spell damage to our Aftershocks. We're also going to want to max out Shattered Earth, because Shattered Earth is going to give us an extra cast of Aftershock each time we cast Aftershock. We're also going to be grabbing Upheaval and going all the way to Dust Storm. This build focuses a lot around physical damage and damage over time, so this fits in really nicely. Now, I want to give an honorable mention to Snow Crash here. If you happen to have extra points, you could put points in here. These are going to consume mana, but this is just extra spells being cast on top of everything we've already got going on. So if you have the extra skill points, go for it. For our passive skill trees, we're going to be grabbing Attunement, some spell damage, some health, and the ability to dual wield in the first tree. For our Shaman tree, we're mostly going to be grabbing Attunement and some attack speed. We're also going to be grabbing spell damage and a couple of ways to get Storm Bolts to cast. So we've got this one here that has a chance to cast when we're hit, and then we have this one here that gives us a chance for it to cast when we hit something else. And this is the damage reduction that I talk about. Then in our Beastmaster tree, we have the aspect of the boar, and we have the aspect of the shark. The aspect of the shark helps us shred enemy armor and also gives us more attack speed. And the aspect of the boar is that damage reduction. Now, I not only maxed out the points in aspect of the boar here, but I also put 2 points into boar heart here, because I wanted to make sure that even if we're not getting hit by melee attacks to trigger it the other way, we're gonna get it from attacking ourselves. With the amount of attack speed we have, 8% should be enough to keep it up pretty much all the time. And of course, more damage reduction from Earthsign Strength. Then finally, in the Druid tree, we're just getting some armor and some endurance here, and we're also gonna get some extra attribute points here. If you want to take points from anywhere to put other places in the build, this is the spot to take it out of. So first off, I'm going to talk briefly about the idols. So the idols are actually a fairly important part of the build, because on melee hit, we're going to have a chance of casting those Aftershocks. In addition, we're also going to increase the effectiveness of our aspect of the boar. That means more damage reduction. Now, our aspect of the boar, because we've got boar heart and porcine constitution, we're actually getting 30% damage reduction here. But because of the increased effect from the idols, we can actually push this up to be about 40% damage reduction. Combining that with Earthsign Strength, we're getting over 50% damage reduction. And then we have another 7% damage reduction coming from our Conflux. And I misspoke earlier, these Aftershocks are actually 8% at the high end, so we can get about 30% chance to get the Aftershocks on melee attack. Now, I'm still working out on itemizing this build when it comes to gear, but I found some really strong synergies and I kind of went with it. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Wing Guards. This is going to make it to where we can't deal critical strikes, but because we're not dealing critical strikes anyways for the most part, and we have damage over time that can't critical strike, this item is actually extremely nice for us. It has a 40% melee attack speed, and if we add on an attack speed using legendary potential, we're getting another 30%. This also has endurance on it, and some other items that looked good for the build also have endurance. So here, Core of the Mountain, we're getting more endurance threshold, we're getting armor, some damage immunity, and with legendary potential, we can throw on a Tempest Strike. And then for our amulet, again, we're getting endurance, some health, some attack speed, and if we drop below 30% health, we're going to be restored to full. Now, if you're somebody that comes from Diablo, you might be thinking, oh, why all the endurance? That's just damage reduction while injured. Well, the difference between this and something like Diablo 4 is that the endurance in this game takes into effect part of the damage that you take. So let's say you have 1,000 health, and an enemy deals 1,000 damage to you. In Diablo 4, that would kill you. In this game, however, based off of your endurance, you're going to have damage reduction while you are injured, and that's going to apply for any portion of that damage that comes after that percentage or threshold. That means we're significantly reducing our chance of dying. Now, continuing on the theme of endurance, for our Helmet's Implicit, we're going with endurance, and this one is actually very important because it increases our endurance threshold based off of our maximum life. So here you can see it's up to 10%. We're also going to be adding spell damage to our Tempest Tree, getting some levels of Earthquake, and increasing our health and armor. For weapons, we're going with a Scepter on the main hand. And here I went with the one that has the highest spell damage, but there's another very good scepter that has slightly lower spell damage, but also has increases to damage over time. Either one of those scepters is going to be perfectly fine. We're going to focus on the melee attack speed here, and we're going to get more spell damage and physical penetration. I threw Chance to Shock on just because we have a passive that gives us the increased damage reduction if enemies are shocked, but there's a couple different ways we can get this in the build, including both weapons and our blessings. You could also use an idol. For our offhand, we're going to be using a one-handed sword. Now, originally I had a one-handed axe here, and I think a one-handed axe still works reasonably well. There's two unique axes that are quite nice. There's Undisputed, which gives you a ton of attack speed, and then there's another that gives you plus to your Primalist skills. I think those are fine as placeholders, so I'll give them an honorable mention, but I think we want to focus on the one-handed sword because it can get the flat spell damage that we really need. Now, I went with this implicit even though it's slightly lower melee damage because it has the increased damage over time on it. It also has an insanely fast base attack speed. We're also going to add the extra attack speed and physical penetration, and a chance to shred armor on this one. For our rings, we're going with Opal implicit because we want the increased cooldown and the extra attributes. The main stat we're looking for here is spell damage. We're also going to go with some increased physical damage, one resistance stat, as well as the defensive stat. Pretty much the same thing on the other ring, but I went with a different resist. Then for our belt, I went with the implicit with the most armor on it, and the main stat we're looking for here is increased physical damage. The increased mana regen here is not necessary, but it's the best thing we can get in the slot, so I went with it. I also went with 2 health stats as the suffixes. We already talked about the gloves. For the boots, there's a couple of different options that seem pretty good. I went with this implicit because it has a good amount of armor, it has movement speed, and it reduces the damage we take from critical strikes. The stat I focused on here was movement speed, added some attunement, as well as some health and a resist stat. And then for our relic, I went with the implicit that has endurance. You could also go for the one that has leech, but assuming you have the blessing for leech, you probably don't have to have that here. I also did +4 to Warcry. I think that technically Warcry only needs +2 to be optimal, but this also comes with endurance threshold, so this is a twofer. Then we went for increased physical damage, endurance, and 1 resist stat. Then for the blessings, I went with Immortality for the endurance, Fury of the North for the shred physical, Memory of the Masters for the class specific shards, Resolve of Humanity for the all resist, Hope of the Beginning for the prefix shard drop rate, Cruelty of the Maruna for the shock chance, Enmity of Clans for the increased one-handed sword drop rate, Hunger of the Void for the spell leech, Embrace of the Ice for the increased body armor drop rate, and Mark of Agony for the increased adorned idol drop rate. Now with this link, you can either click on the left and create your own loot filter, or if you go in my Discord, at discord.gg/screamheart, I'm putting one that's similar to this, but I customized it so that it's a little more than what they give you by default. And just as a quick example of the loot filter I'm including in the build, if you're familiar with Epoch Tool's default coloring system, then this is pretty much it. The main thing you're going to want to do is scroll down, and whenever you're leveling up, if you find that you're not finding these blue items useful anymore, then you're going to want to go through and uncheck all of these. And then if you move up, the green items are going to require 3 affixes, and then you can move up and the yellow are going to require even more affixes. In the end game, you're only going to want to see the red items, so I'll probably end up unchecking these orange items soon. But right now, I can still get a possible upgrade from orange, so that's where I'm going to leave mine. Then the pink are for high value affixes. These are mostly going to be for the level on our skills. And then we have this bluish green for our idols. We're going to be hiding everything for other classes, so if you plan on playing multiple classes, you can uncheck this if you want to. We're also hiding item types that we're not using. So for example, if you wanted to have a chance of using axes while you level up, then you could come in here and you could uncheck one-handed axes. Same thing for daggers. Daggers and wands are both usable items in this build, so you could uncheck both of these. But if you're in the end game and you're looking for those specific items you need, then you're not going to want to see these. We've also got it set to show all personal items, all experimental items, all exalted items, all unique, and all set items. I hope you guys enjoy the changes to the build. I've really been working hard on trying to perfect this as much as possible. Obviously, I'm still learning the game, but I think I'm making steps in the right direction. If there's any changes you'd like to see in the build, let me know. Also, just let me know how the build is working for you. I'll drop the updated and final version once I've gotten to level 100 and I get some time spent in the end game. But I appreciate you guys being here, and I'll see you in the next video. Screamheart out. My god, 2 games? What is this madness?